Hi, welcome to the fourth session on probabilistic programming. Today we'll be talking about latent variable and dynamic models. So in the latent variable part, we'll be looking at a Gaussian mixture model and how to infer parameters using variational Bayesian inference. And in the dynamic model part, we'll be estimating states in a linear Gaussian dynamical system. This is the final probabilistic programming session. I assume that you are familiar with all of the previous ones. You'll need to be familiar with all of them in order to be able to follow along. This is by far the most advanced session. So, the story in the latent variable models. So, a set of archaeologists reaches out to you and asks you for your help. You've probably seen this before in a National Geographic documentary. Primitive humans used to sharpen stones to make spearheads and arrowheads and axes and stuff. So this process of shaping a stone involves base stone and a worker stone. You strike the base stone and then flakes chip off until the base stone is sharp. These chips fall to the floor, they get covered, and time passes on, and then archaeologists go dig somewhere, and then they find these flakes again. So what they're actually interested in is in whether primitive humans have used different techniques to sharpen stones over the centuries. But they only have these flakes to go on. So what they would like to know is whether there are different types of flakes and whether these types of flakes represent different techniques in sharpening. So we are going to cluster the data on these flakes to see if we can find certain types. So we have a data set that is available from the UCI machine learning repository. The original data set is quite rich, so if you're interested in this setting, have a look. For now, we'll just be using two attributes. And it's also, each instance represents summary information of all of the flakes at one particular site. So they might measure a lot of things for flakes at that site and then report the average or the mean or the max or something. So we will actually only be using the two attributes flaking angle and then the proportional dorsal surface worked. Flaking angle represents the angle which the base stone was struck to produce the flake, and the other attribute is a measure of whether you would strike the base stone somewhere in the middle or on the edge. I've done some pre-processing on this dataset, namely z-scoring. I've also removed two outliers, and this should help us. This prepares the dataset essentially for a Gaussian mixture model. So this is the dataset. You can see that it's not clustered in a very precise, explicit manner, but you do see that it's more densely packed here than here, for instance. Right, so the Gaussian mixture model, Bert goes into this in more detail in his latent variable lecture, so if you're unfamiliar, go have another look at his lectures. I will just be going over it quite briefly to remind you of certain parts and to refamiliarize you with certain names that we'll be using later on in the code. So we have a generative model that's a joint distribution. X are the observations. That's each instance represents a collection site, and then two attributes for the flaking angle and the dorsal surface metric. Excuse me. Then we have a latent variable z or z. So you imagine in a mixture model, each observation is believed to have originated from one component. So we have a Gaussian mixture model, so we have Gaussian components, and so the assignment variable z in this case represents the degree to which the ith observation belongs to the kth component. So phi are mixture weights, and then mu and precision matrix lambda are the parameters of the Gaussian components. So this generative model factorizes into a likelihood of the observations given the assignment variables and then the parameters of the Gaussian component, plus times a prior on the latent variable, so P of Z given the mixture weights phi, and then times all of the prior parameters, the priors for the parameters. You'll notice that these are not marginal distributions, so it's not P of mu, then P of lambda, then P of phi, but this is P of mu given lambda, and then P of lambda. So this is actually a joint prior, and this joint prior factorizes as follows into P of mu given lambda, and then P of lambda. Why that's the case, we'll get into that a bit later. Right, so the observation of the likelihood of the ith observation is a product of Gaussians, each of which is raised to the to a certain power. So each Gaussian represents a component. We have a product of k Gaussians, so we have k Gaussian components. Mu of k and lambda of k are the mean and precision matrix, as I said. And then this power that's raised to is whether the ith observation belongs to the kth component. So this equality is if the ith observation came from the first component, then in this product it will be so this is a product over 1, 2, 3, so that will be raised to the power 1 in the for the first component, and then raised to the power 0 for the second component, raised to the power 0 for the third component. So it's a probability under the first component times 1 times 1. The prior for each latent variable Zi follows a categorical distribution. And that's parameterized by the mixture weight phi. Then we have the priors for the parameters. So we have this P of phi, which is the Dirichlet distribution that's conjugate to the categorical. So we'll probably also get a, or not probably, we'll get a Dirichlet posterior out for the mixture weights phi. Excuse me. Sorry. So we have here a set of Gaussian components, but each component has a single mu of k and lambda k. So we're talking about individual Gaussian likelihoods, and the conjugate prior for the Gaussian likelihood is a joint, the multivariate Gaussian likelihood is a joint normal Wishart distribution. So that is a normal Wishart distribution, the combination of a normal distribution for the mean and a Wishart distribution for the precision parameter. But then the normal distribution for the mean, its precision is actually, or is partly determined by the precision parameter lambda. So this might look a bit complicated, but what we have here is the conjugate prior for the Gaussian likelihood. So this is actually mathematically and computationally the nicest specification of the prior, because that will produce a Gaussian posterior for the mean and a Gaussian and a Wishart posterior for the precision parameter. Right, so how to implement this model. We'll see that it's actually the implementation in Formulab, and as I mentioned earlier, the Formulab is just one way in which you could do probabilistic programming. There are quite a lot of software packages in different languages, but the communities, so the machine learning community and the communities for each of the programming languages, they're all converging on a single model specification language convention. So what you see here in how we specify for Formulab is going to resemble the general way in which we do probabilistic programming in the future. First we'll do a bit of bookkeeping in executing this model. So we have we're going to extract the number of features, number of samples from the data set. I am going to set the number of mixture components to 3. I'm going to define this convenience variable. That's just the identity matrix for the number of features. So the number of features here will be 2, so this is just a 2-dimensional identity matrix. So mixture models can be sensitive to initialization, so we are going to specify the prior parameters explicitly. So why is it sensitive to initialization? It's the model has a particular structure which involves when you do inference on that, you'll get a non-convex optimization problem, which is going to be determined by, so if you initialize it in some way, you might get a different answer than if you initialize it in some other way. That's one aspect. The second thing is that in mixture model, if you were to initialize all of the components, the priors for all of the components at exactly the same location, then initially all of the assignments would be exactly equal, and so you would not get a fair update. And so basically the model gets stuck there. That's the second part of the sensitivity initialization. So first of all, initialization cannot be equal for all components, and secondly, we might get different results for different initializations. That's just unavoidable in mixture models. So here I've defined the prior means to be, so it's a bivariate situation, so the first mean is at 1, 1 minus 1, then 0, 0, and then minus 1, 1. So they're on a line in feature space. So the Wishart distribution has a scale matrix and a degree of freedom, and so here the priors for the Wishart distribution, they can be identical. So we'll just use identity matrices for the scale matrices, and we'll just use the number of features as the degrees of freedom. The mixture weights, they need the prior concentration parameters, and we'll just set them to 1s. If you remember from the second probabilistic programming session where we visualized this simplex, the 1s are just going to give you a reasonably flat simplex. Now to start this factor graph, we are going to initialize certain factor variables. So we have n or the factor of assignment variables is of length n. The factor of observations is of length n, and we have k precision matrices and k means. The mixture weights themselves, so we have 3 of them because that's the number of components that we use, but we take these concentration parameters. So there's our you can see here that's the number of components. We'll put these straight into a single Dirichlet distribution. So for the components, we can iterate over the number of components, and then we can populate the kth entry of this factor variables with a random variable saying that they're that the precision matrices are a Wishart distribution with the priors for the scale matrix and the degrees of freedom. And then for the mean, we say that the mean is Gaussian parameterized by these prior means M0 that's specified here, and then the precision matrix that I specified just above here. I'm going to push all of these variables into a list, and then later on I'm going to feed that into a custom Gaussian mixture node in Fornilab. So I'm going to push them into a list called theta, and later on I'm going to unpack this list in the argument list for the Gaussian mixture node. So yeah, and then we still need to iterate over the number of samples. So we say that the ith assignment variable is categorically distributed with parameters phi, and we say that the ith observation x belongs to a Gaussian mixture with the ith assignment variable and all of the parameters of the k components in here. And then we say that the ith observation is observed. So this is actually quite compact, and it matches the math quite nicely. So phi is a Dirichlet distribution. You've seen that here. P of phi is a Dirichlet. Then the precision matrix lambda is a Wishart. We've seen that here. P of lambda k is a Wishart. So here it's written as a W0, so that should be a V0. And there should be an N0 degrees of freedom. And the mu is the prime mean is the mean of the kth component is a Gaussian, with these prior means and these precision matrix that matches this conditional distribution here. Yeah, and then the fact that Zi is categorical with phi, that matches this distribution. And so the reason we made this custom Gaussian mixture node is that this expression, this line, matches this likelihood expression that you see here. So it's the product over k Gaussians with a particular assignment variable Zi, and then parameters for each of the k Gaussians. That's quite a compact description. Now we're going to, so we can't visualize this because it's another IAD setting, so the graph will be too large. Now we're going to compile an inference algorithm. So before we've either had a single unknown variable or maybe two unknown variables, but now we have a lot more of them. We also are going to use variational Bayes, so we'll be approximating the true posterior. And so we need to indicate to Formulab how the posterior factorizes. So here we're saying that we're using a mean field factorization. So phi is a separate variable, Z is a separate variable, so all Z's, and then we have separate variables for each of the means and precision matrices of the components. We'll generate a message passing algorithm, and we'll want to look at the free energy to see whether it's nicely decaying and whether it's converged after a number of iterations. Right, so now how to execute the algorithm. We've taken the data set and then again reformatted it into a list of vectors for the observations, and we'll feed that into this data dictionary. The main difference to before is that we now have to prepare the recognition distributions. We have to initialize them. That basically means that we say that these unknown variables phi, mu, lambda, and Z, we're going to give them some starting distribution, and then through the variational message passing process, each of these will be updated with new parameters until convergence. So phi is a Dirichlet distribution, and that's just a unit Dirichlet. Each of the mu k and lambda k marginals are Gaussian mean precision and Wishart. Note that you don't need to link these two right now. We have used the mean field factorization, so the approximating distribution Q of mu and Q of lambda are independent of each other, whereas the original generative model P of mu and P of lambda are not independent of each other. The assignment variable is categorical, and it's also initialized to a uniform probability for each of the options, for each of the components. We'll be using 20 iterations, and here I'm pre-allocating a list of floats to track the free energy in each iteration. Now we're actually going to execute it. So as I said before, it's a variational Bayesian procedure, so we'll be updating each of the recognition factors. We're going to start with updating the assignment variable, step of Z. So step of Z is compiled with this algorithm source code function, and we specified that we wanted these sets, so we've given that name. So in this, you can imagine this process that, so we've defined a set of Gaussians, and then step of Z, and we infer what the assignment is of each observation under those Gaussians. And then given those assignment variables, we can update each of the parameters, update each of the mixture weights, and then the means and variances of each of the means and precisions of each of the Gaussian components. And so you would iterate this. So update the assignment, update parameters, update the assignments, update parameters. Yeah, and so as I said, this step Z function came because I called the variable Z just Z in this posterior factorization function, and then phi, I call that phi, and then mu1, lambda 1, mu2, etc. These correspond to these variables that are specified. So you can see in this posterior factorization, I'm telling Formulab, okay, these are all the unknown variables, and this is how they factorize in my variational Bayesian procedure. I want you to generate update functions for each of those. I'm going to call those update functions by these names, these IDs that I give them, and then I can iterate all of these updates until convergence. And that'll give me parameter estimates. Right, so it takes about 30 seconds to run this model on all of the observations. If you look at the free energy, so free energy is dimensionless, so it doesn't have, it's hard to read this Y scale. But what we're looking for is that the free energy nicely decays over the number of iterations, and it starts to even out, that it starts to converge, starts to become a flat line, which is exactly what it does. So if we now visualize the resulting parameter estimates, we're going to get something like this. You can see, so the black dots are the original samples that I showed earlier. You can see we have one component that nicely covers this more densely packed region. We have one wider component that covers all of the outliers above that, and then we have one component that that covers all of these points in this area. So this doesn't look like a bad fit, and we could show this to the archaeologists, and they might be interested in how well these three components cover all of these points. If you really want to find out whether there are types in the data, then you would rerun the model with a different number of components and then check which is the best fit. But this already looks like a nice fit. So that's actually something that I would like you to try for yourself. So play around with the number of components. Can you get an equally good coverage with just 2 components? What if you had 4? This is a good test for you, whether you've fully understood how the Gaussian mixture model works in its variational form, and how we can use Formulab to do inference. So try changing the number of components, maybe try changing the, so what if you had 2 components or 4 components, compute the free energy for each of those, the final free energy after 20 iterations, and if the free energy for 3 components is lower than for 4 components and 2 components, then you could report back to the archaeologist saying that you've uncovered 3 types of flakes in the data. Alright, next time we'll be talking about the linear Gaussian dynamical system. See you next time.